Catherine, reading the book, I had a lot of different reactions. Like, I guess my first question is, were you afraid anyone would take everything you said seriously?
Yes, very much so. My husband read the book and he was like, "I'm afraid you really think some of these things." But it is written firmly tongue in cheek. Sometimes, honestly, I do have a dark sense of humor. So if someone's going to go there, it's usually me.
Yeah, I love that dark sense of humor. I love your sense of humor. You're a wonderful writer. And I thought this sentence, Poe never lies to you about how painful life can be. It cheered me up. And
Yeah, it's true.
yeah, for me, I think being in the self-help world for 30 years, that's always been the thing that's been maybe the hardest for me, maybe not. It's also all the hucksters and people selling stuff that is total bullshit. But it's also this idea that there isn't room for the dark side. There isn't room for the truth.
Mm,
And that's one of the things I really appreciated about the book. And I really appreciate about the way you've been writing about getting published, the whole process on your Substack.
mm.
I appreciate that a
Yeah, I
lot.
hope I, I don't want to linger too much over those parts of life, but I also think that if you're going to, like I wanted to, offer real comfort, you have to show the full scope of reality, or at least try to.
Mhm.
What people are up against is very real.
And that's where you came from when you started the book.
Yeah, for sure. In a very dark place when I got this idea, as I don't know, maybe it comes across, but yeah, it's one of the worst phases of my life by a lot.
Given that, what was it like to do such a deep dive into not a healthy mind? That's one of the things I wonder, like when people write thrillers or they could do true crime podcasts or something. I'm always like, oh my God, or they play a character who is a Death Eater in Harry Potter. What does that do to
Mm.
you?
Well, that's real. I will say that when I first started to get into Poe and I really started to dig through the biographies, and there are so many of those, I was in a dark place myself. And so, in a way, I felt very comforted and like I had found a fellow traveler. And like you said, like somebody who's not going to lie to me about how bad things can be. But I also think that's exactly why the story is so perversely hopeful, because of how dark it is at the same time, and yet all that Poe accomplished, getting his work done in spite of near endless tragedy.
Mhm.
For me, at a moment of such profound depression, to hear something like that was both a very grounded message and an extremely hopeful one at the same time. So I can't imagine something that was actually more helpful than that. It's not that I dislike the you are a badasses of the world. I've read those books too, but at least for my mental landscape, it doesn't nearly get dark enough to show you, a way forward.
So at what point in finding Poe and starting to read him and think about it, did the book really take on a shape and find its point? Like, how long did that take?
It was a couple of months.
Okay.
I started So it was late 2016 when I found myself in this very terrible depression. And I started reading him. It was the only thing I could concentrate on at all.
Oh.
And over a period of those weeks that became months, I read Poe's catalog, which is humongous. And then I started reading the biographies and his letters. And one night I was out just meeting a friend for a drink, and I started telling him he's a historian. I was like, oh, the weirdest thing is happening. Edgar Allan Poe is cheering me up. And he said, that sounds like a book. And at first I thought that's the funniest thing ever. Yeah, I'm going to write it and we'll call it How to Say Nevermore to Your Problems. And totally a joke that I jotted down on a napkin. And then I stayed with the idea, and it became less of a joke to me. And then I wrote an essay for The Millions, a literary website. It was published in September of 2017. And it was about the whole idea. I didn't mention that I had an idea to maybe make this all into a book, but the essay itself, which was about 2,500 words long, it did so well. For anything literary, it went viral by those standards. And I started to get attention from agents even before they knew that there was a book proposal here. So it was early 2018 when I actually signed with an agent and started, shopping the proposal and that sort of thing.
One of the things that I'm always curious about in the it, evolution of an idea is, did at any point you feel like, shoot, I've backed into this and I'm not sure I want to do it? Did it become more about, because I've done that. My second book I wrote, the couples comfort book, was a split second idea that I wrote down in the book proposal for the first one. We could turn this into a series. That is as much thought as I gave it. And then it did become a series. And I was like, what the hell have I done? And there was lots of good that came out of it. But I think about these moments in our creative paths where we really might go down it for years. And should we reflect on this more, or is that just the roll of the dice and how life works?
I will say that I sometimes, and not to sound totally woo, but I am a little woo on the point that the process teaches you how to write the book.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
mean, in its original iteration, from my original book proposal in early 2018, the book was a very dark memoir of depression and very literary in its pitch.
Okay.
And the agent I had at the time wanted to sell it to the Ferris Strauss-Giroux of the world. And we went to all those folks and they all rejected it. A lot of like platform issues and that sort of thing. People saw the potential, but they're like, I'm not really sure how this is going to work or where it's going to be in a bookstore. And initially I was really depressed by that. All those rejections hit me very hard. But over time, I thought, you know what, I should really make this more of a mass market title, like more like Poe's work, where a total cross-section of life enjoys his work. It's not just scholars, it's not just folks in academia or the highbrow folks. It's literally everyone. He has an NFL team named for one of his poems. That's how mainstream it is. And it's something that I admire so intensely about his career and his oeuvre. Over time, I started to make this into a more mass market title, taking it in a lighter direction, a less personal direction. And now I am so insanely thankful for that happening like that, because now doing interviews about the book, I realized that it's very hard to linger over this dark period of my life. I'm glad it's not really in the book. It's the background story in my own mind, but it's not really, as you've seen, figuring in the book that strongly. It's not really a book about me. It's about
it's not.
Readers of Poe. And I feel so much more comfortable with that direction. And I feel like the book has more to offer the world because it's less personal. So if that didn't happen that way, I don't know that I ever would have gotten there.
Yeah, I had a similar experience with writing a memoir that didn't work. And then eventually it became my last book, Why Bother? There is a way that we can hold too tightly to our preciousness. And
I definitely think that's the thing that has surprised me most about that process, is how smart and informative market reactions have been for the book, because often artists think, oh, if I don't adhere only to my own vision, if I'm only true to myself, then that's how you make great work. And I'm not at all sure that's true. I'm not making a big claim about this being like the greatest book of all time, but I do think that the information that I got both from editors, from agents, from the market itself has been really good for me.
Yeah, I find that there's this, when I'm working with writers and when I'm working on my own work, I try to hold both, like what's really juicy and true for me, because if it's not there, I can't write it. Like when I used to write a national magazine column, I loathed doing it. When they first hired me, one magazine hired me, they're like, we read your newsletter and we love it. You can write that. And so I could write about whatever I wanted. But then the magazine got bought and then it became an advice column. And I loathed doing it because I couldn't figure out where I was in it. It was like I was trying to perform. So I think that's one direction that can be really draining. But then the other direction I see from myself in the past and writers I work with is, it's got to be my vision or the highway. And that really doesn't work either. So did you find like the middle ground for you with this book, that where you still were really like, I'm on board with this and I believe it and I'm interested in it, but I'm also writing it knowing that it's this tongue-in-cheek look at how Poe can help you with your life?
Yeah, the process of, so the book sold at auction and I spoke to a couple of editors who were bidding. And I had this funny experience in the weeks before auction, or it was really about the week before auction, where one editor, a very nice big name imprint, was like, I want you to make this thing tragic. So rewrite your 4,000 word writing sample and show me that this is a tragic book. And then my editor, Georgiana at Running Press, said, you know what, I really think this is a funny book, and I want you to rewrite this same writing sample. Obviously, neither of them know they're both saying these things to me.
Right.
She says, I want you to write this as a pure joke. So in a week, I had to turn around but the tragic example and then the comic example of this, or these people might not bid on my book and it might never get published. And my hair was absolutely on fire for a week. But it was also a kind of process by which I could tell what I feel like is A, the direction I want to spend the most time with, and B, the direction that's probably going to have the biggest appeal to the widest audience. And it was the humorous one, which was so much more fun to work on than the tragic one. And I think that's an underrated aspect of what we do. Like, is it fun to work on or not? Because if it's a grind, like you're saying with the magazine column, holy crap, that doesn't really go away, at least in my experience.
And it's really draining over time. It's really dangerous over time, I think. I've been teetering on the edge of creative burnout I many times in my career, but definitely since the pandemic. And I'm really identifying some of the things that I do to myself that lend or increase that condition. And that's definitely one of them. Not having fun. I think related to this, tell me what you think of this. We get this sort of tragic, let's use that word, tragic idea of what it means to be a writer, and that we have to suffer and it has to always be hard. And I feel like I really want to reject that and help other people reject that it can be fun and it can be commercial and it can be delightful.
I mean, I think sometimes the creative brief you get is tough. When I was getting both these kind of assignments from editors, each of them was tough in its own way, because it's tough to play a sad story for jokes. It's tough to spend so much time with just a sad story in just that one sad register. But also, when you get the tough creative brief, like, you can tell whether there's going to be room in this assignment for you to enjoy it or not. The project's always giving you information. At least that's how I feel. Like, the project is teaching me how to write it. And with the comic vein, obviously that's just, maybe it's obvious that that's just going to be more fun. Like, that we are going to like punchiness to this thing and kind of roll through it in a more lighthearted vein than it's been treated in the past.
So it also sounds like, to go back to the question a little bit ago, that finding the point and the shape of the project, it took a lot of iterations. Like, that was the final iteration when you were in auction or about to go into auction, this is going to be a funny book. Yeah,
it's wild that it had so many. I rewrote the proposal top to bottom 3 different times. And as you probably know, it's 10,000 words long. And you put your heart and soul into that. It was my first nonfiction book proposal. And even as from the very beginning, I was having to learn how to write one as I was writing one. You're flying the plane and building it at the same time. But I'm very thankful for how that worked out. I feel like it worked out like it should have. And it's given me a whole career direction that I didn't know was there. Maybe you can write very sad literary biographies that are played for laughs.
Subgenre, a new genre.
Yeah.
Catherine has invented a new genre. But I just did, not to drive this home too many times, but one of the things I see both in myself and writers I work with is this sometimes inability, but resistance to doing that work, to find the point, to find the shape, to find the voice. Like, it should just spring forth. And sometimes it does, but a lot of times it doesn't. And I think you're being open to that and playing with it over so many years is a really interesting observation for all of us.
We're often, at least this was my training in my undergrad and my grad, that you don't pay, that you're supposed to keep the market outside your creative process. You're supposed to not pay attention to audience. You're only supposed to pay attention to yourself and your inner voice, which strikes me now is utterly crazy because you are creating for an audience. So it's good to get feedback instead of the project being this utterly instilling yourself sort of thing. I think the more that we open up to feedback from the marketplace, from readers, the better off we are.
I agree.
And oftentimes in the beginning, that's hard. I'm not saying it's always easy. A lot of this was like the product of being in the school of hard knocks and being a freelancer for a very long time, where you've gone through this process with editors on a mini basis so many times that it's less scary when it starts happening with a book. So if you're not there right now, to the listener, I understand that it's not where people tend to start.
Yeah. And I also say, especially if you're writing things that feel very dear to you, or memoir, personal essay, sometimes you have to be like, I know I'm stretching to connect to that person who's out there somewhere, but I don't want them to be in the room with me yet. I have to find more of I have to get at least the first something out before I can let them come closer. Yeah. And that's very accurate to do as well. So you mentioned the P word, platform. And one of the things that I really both find extraordinarily irritating and maddening is how people talk and approach platform, and how scared they get of it, and how publishers misuse it. But you did you've been writing and talking now about platform because you did a very wise thing. Part of your calculation as this book developed for you was to use Poe's platform. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who are writers who are trying to write books, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, they're getting feedback of your platform isn't large enough. You don't have enough Twitter followers or Instagram followers or what have you. You don't have big enough bylines if you're a freelancer. And that's real. In fact, now that I'm promoting a book, I really understand why publishers care so much about those things. But my hack evolving over time for this was, I'm actually quite an introverted person. I don't really want to have a million Twitter followers. It's not really my jam. I don't love social media, but I do want to write books. So over time, I figured out that if I take a famous subject, Poe is humongous. He has 4 million Facebook fans, speaking of platform. He has houses and museums in 4 different American cities. There are Poe festivals all over the world and inside the US. So his platform is humongous. And when I was writing my proposal, I concentrated on those things. And I literally said to publishers, it's not about me, it's about Poe. And you can see the demand for his work and the demand for Poe products. There are Poe socks and Poe mugs and Poe office decor. So he's not an unmerchandised guy. And this has been wonderful for me in that it means I don't have to have that like uber public life that, say, an Instagram personality has to have in order to sell cookbooks or what have you. So I think if you write about a famous subject, you can get around the platform issue a little bit. It doesn't mean that you can have no public role at all. You have to. It's just the territory. Is that something you found too?
Yeah, I have. I've been lucky. I was lucky to start before any of this was an issue. The word didn't even exist 3 years ago. And then to evolve with it very early on, Harper had I think it was probably like 1999. They had they invited all their authors to come in, and they taught us about growing an email list.
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, this is really important. So I was lucky to do stuff, but then it evolves and you can't necessarily keep up, or you don't evolve with it. So there's definitely some mistakes that I made. So one of the things you're starting to do on podcasts is talk to other writers and people who lead writing communities about what are some of the ways to leverage or build a platform. And what are some of the things that you're seeing come out of your mouth as you're learning this, given your experience that's unfolding in real time?
Having had some time to reflect on this, I think one of the reasons I even ever heard this was a book idea was because I was talking to a friend who is a historian who's written biographies of Jefferson and so on. So it just happened to be that the audience, like when I bounced this idea that I didn't even know I was bouncing, that person has already made a career of writing about literary community often, and this is in self-help too. We often a lot of people's projects are exclusively about themselves in their own lives. And I understand that in a way it saves you a lot of time on research because you have all that material ready to hand. And if you're a person with a day job or kids or whatever, that's an amazing hack to be writing about yourself. But also that is when you're in a narrow niche of you have to have the platform, because it's very hard to sell memoir or anything like that otherwise. As I learned myself in my own process, like I had 10 years of freelance experience and I couldn't sell a book that was pretty personal.
Mhm.
So when I opened it up and I started writing, that I made the focus of the book is all Edgar Allan Poe, I was able to start to put numbers to everything. Like in my proposal, I say he has 4 million Facebook fans, but that's just the headline on that thing, because there are all these sub fan groups that are private groups. And here's one with 40,000 people. Here's one with 19,000 people. And I can do, like when the book comes out, I'm going to do Facebook Live in those channels.
Mhm.
And I've been spending years as a fan in those groups. And so I know the people and whatnot.
That I'm just
Anyway,
going
I
to stop
started-
you there. That's really important, because I think that's one thing that people don't realize. They might do that research, but realize you need to already be a community member. You can't, in a lot of cases, just show up. Sometimes you can and say, hey, will you do a Facebook Live with me? But having been there and commented and been part of it and using it for your research is a huge advantage.
I think that's so true. You don't want to just parachute in. It's an old saw, but it's true that this business is about relationship and about connections and network. And I mean, also, you'll enjoy it more too. You don't want to have a strictly transactional relationship with folks. It's better to, especially now we're all so alone with the pandemic, like it's better to have online friends than not. Anyway, though, in my proposal, I was able to start putting numbers to those things. And that's why you start to convince people with data. It becomes less subjective. And with publishing, you're often, when people get rejections, they're often told, like, oh, this is a subjective business. Don't take this personally. And for writers trying to sell work, I think the more you're able to make an objective case for why this is going to find an audience and why you're going to have sales, the better off you're going to be. I will also say, too, that at least for me, I found so much freedom in concentrating on a topic. Usually, and this is my experience getting an MA in creative writing and so on, there's all this focus on finding your voice. It can feel masturbatory, to be totally frank. Whereas with a topic, like you drill down and down, and there's just an endless entertaining rabbit hole to the thing, which I enjoyed so much more than, say, writing a personal essay, which I've done too. But
yeah, you wrote about that on your Substack, the difference between finding your angle versus finding your voice. Something I might not have gotten that right.
it was for Jane's site.
Oh, it was for Jane Friedman's site.
Because I mean, honestly, I'm annoyed by that voice advice now. I think that it's very limiting to focus exclusively on yourself. If you're able to look out to the world and spot fan communities that you're going to be able to address with your work, all of a sudden you've got an audience, and it's not this inert thing that's just to do with yourself. I'm not saying, obviously, personal writing has a huge role to play, and I'm not downing it. I did it for years.
You also have a very distinctive voice in the book.
I do think voice is important. I love like Mary Roach and other voices I can think of that I will read. And Samantha Irby, I will read anything she writes. I would read her grocery list because she's so funny and an enlivening person to just spend time with. So it's not that voice does it. When you really want to take something out into the world and you don't have a massive platform, that's when it can be so useful to have this whole topic of interest attached to your project.
I also think the point that you made in the Jane Friedman piece, and this feels like a theme of our conversation, is if going inside is not doing it for you, that doesn't mean you can't write. There is so many different ways to be a writer in the world. And I think that's part of what your last few years has shown you and is showing us. You had a lot of different experiences, a lot of different kinds of writing. You were in a dark place. And by working that and being open and curious, you found a different way to write, which doesn't mean that won't change and you won't write different things in the future. But I think the openness and the curiosity is what really struck me about your story and made me want to talk to you, because I think we do make it too precious sometimes. I know I have.
Also, I mean, yeah, I definitely have. I mean, this process that I went through with this book was having the preciousness beaten out of me over time through the sheer number and volume of rejections. So that's how I got to this place. I didn't start there, but I'm very thankful. I know that sounds silly, and and not true, but it absolutely is where I landed with this place. It got me to a register where I could really start to explore some things that were interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's really inspiring to me. It really makes me think differently about what I might write next, because I do think we still have this idea in our culture that creativity comes from the muses, that it comes from someplace deep inside of us, and we're either bestowed with the gift or we're not. And it's just so clear to me that creativity is combinatorial, and you have these different experiences from this idea that it kept morphing and changing until it combined into something that people really love.
I think, in the vein of what you're saying, that creativity is cumulative. It's the
Mhm.
creation of experiences over time. And that's how you get some of the information that ends up ultimately shaping your work, which is also, to me, a very hopeful message, because I think of all the bad jobs I've had, years of temping, the years of being utterly broke, the years of going through a tough time and reading like 30 self-help books at once. All that ended up being useful.
Nothing
So
is ever lost.
thank goodness for it. The very, the school of hard knocks aspect.
Yeah, I love that. You wrote a post also on Substack, everything you've made, everything you spent on the book and made on the book. Why did you think that was important to share? I love that you did, but it's pretty brave.
I feel like there's a huge financial aspect of this business that is opaque to people who aren't already in it. And that you can get the wrong idea that writing books is going to make you a lot of money, which is a very rare thing for anyone to have happen. The case is, if you're lucky enough to eventually get published, you're not likely to make very much money from the book itself. So I've been very open about this. I made $20,000 for my advance, and I was lucky to get it. I'm not complaining. But I also, none of this would be possible if I didn't have a day job. I work in marketing full time. I do my freelance journalism on the side. I couldn't be a journalist full time. It just simply does not pay. So I don't want people to have the wrong impression that writing a book is going to change their life in the financial sense. Lord, that could be a bad road. I've seen people go down that. I started to go down that myself in my 20s before I was just absolutely forced to get a job.
I had a friend who went $900,000 in debt. I know.
No.
I know, it just kind of makes you throw up in your mouth. And I remember, this was many decades ago, and I remember telling him, like, please don't do this. And this was before self-publishing was a thing. He self-published these beautiful hardback books. He was very successful in his first business, and he thought he could just take those lessons and translate them to the publishing world. And I'm like, look, buddy, I've been doing this a long time, even at that point, let me tell you. And I remember he wouldn't listen to me, and it was so sad. Anyway.
When I first got out of college and graduate school, I had this idea of like, oh, I'll get a book deal within a few years. And I'll be able to, between book sales and my freelance work, which, as any freelancer knows, you're making like $300 for an 1,100 word article that you may work on for 2 weeks with edits and such. And then you don't get paid maybe for 6 weeks after that. It's not a living unless you're doing it a different way than I do. So anyway, I had those ideas in the beginning, and up until the time I was about 26, like I was trying to make that work, and it did not work. I had $22,000 in student debt. My husband had $5,000 in student debt. So between us, we were like 30 grand in the hole. And it just became clear in our lives, oh, we better start trying to climb some corporate ladder here, or we are going to be in this hole forever. We had no health insurance. We had $300 in cash, and that was our picture. So we just decided to change it. And for years, solid 10 years after that, I felt, I missed the boat. Now publishing is never going to happen. I was doing it on the side, but it's still not my full-time job. And I kept thinking that this means it's not going to happen for me, but I just refused to give up on it too.
Why?
And eventually it did work out. Obsession. I've wanted this since I was a little kid. I think the whole like getting published in the traditional sense, it's you want to play in the pros. And as silly as that may sound, there's a kind of validation that you want from the world, and you want to be like, hey, it's now at this level. So for folks who want that too, I really do understand it. It's something that I wanted for years on end. It didn't change my financial life, nor should it have to. It's just something that I also do in addition to like having a day job and being a mom and that sort of thing.
I love that attitude, because again, another theme we're talking about is just getting over the preciousness of it. And yet at the same time, owning that desire. I still really want this. And so I'm willing to work for it. And you've done an amazing job since the book came out, being really consistent about talking about the book, talking about the publishing behind it, talking about everything we're talking about today. Have you gotten bored with that yet?
I haven't. Thankfully, you can talk about Poe forever. I'm still finding out strange facts about his life and legacy.
Like what? Like what?
Oh, for instance, like when Baltimore media, like I get a lot of interviews about which was the bar in Baltimore that he was drinking at right before he died. Well, he wasn't drinking in any bar right before he died, but many bars claim this in Baltimore, apparently. Also, he's apparently a huge figure in Romanian literature. He made
Romanian.
a cameo on he made a cameo on Gumby. There was a 90210 episode named for the Pit and the Pendulum. So little factoids that have just continued to come at me and that are utterly delightful. And it's a good thing that when you like your book topic, because you have to spend so much time with it. And now I'm like doing, giving lectures on Poe and that sort of thing. There's just an endlessness to the material, which I really love. And then with publishing, wow, I can talk about that all day long too. How the sausage gets made. I always want to hear it from other people. I always, maybe I'm like an overshare on the point just because I know how many wrong impressions I had about the business before I found myself in it. And I wouldn't want anyone to place their bets wrong to the extent that's anything anybody else can influence,
Yeah, I like that. I appreciate that. I like to know how the sausage is made too. Do you have a favorite program in the book? Did I say it right? Program?
Yeah, the lessons of the program. I think embrace the very first Poe tip in the book, which is unnumbered because it's too fundamental to even be labeled number one, is stop looking for models of perfect living. Embrace a brilliant visionary of terrible decisions, because can be so useful. Poe accomplished so much despite or even because of his flaws and mistakes and missteps and feuds and drunkenness. So maybe our own bad habits or bad proclivities are ways that we can open up our own path and achieve some of our goals too. But also that's a ticket out of self-loathing, I will say. I'm a person who tends to obsess about the things I've done wrong. Like I will stop in my tracks and cringe because of some stupid thing I said 3 years ago that hopefully no one else remembers. So anyway, I think there's an element of self-forgiveness to that too, when you change your models to someone who maybe you think of as negative, but isn't necessarily.
I got that very much from the book over and over again, that sense of permission to be more self-accepting and let yourself off the hook without becoming an ass.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to endorse bad behavior for its own sake in any sense. No, not that. I hate cruelty as much as anybody else.
No.
But we often hold ourselves to a high standard that ends up becoming excruciating.
Yeah. You also wrote recently about elevated trolling. Do you want to tell us what that is? It was a perfect article to encapsulate the tone of the book. And I started it, I'm like, oh my God, what is she telling people to do? This is terrible. And then I'm like, oh, I get it. Good idea.
Trolling and trolls are not a practice for people that we tend to, but I think if you understand Poe's literary criticism career can be understood as a form of trolling. The reason he was such a vitriolic critic was because he was trying to attract attention for himself, and that was a wildly successful move. So in a sense, the 1830s, 1840s magazine market was functioning just like the modern day internet, in which people say negative things in order to provoke a reaction. Now, granted, I'm not smiling at that behavior. It can be very awful. And I certainly don't want to be trolled myself, but it does make you realize that how human sort of attention systems work, and how you can, if you develop your own critical sensibility, there's nothing wrong with making sort of harsh judgments if you know the field and you really know what you're talking about. I don't mean that folks should be mean, but to be incisive is very valuable. So there's a lot that we can learn from Poe's career in the sense of like how he became famous himself. was practicing just that sort of, well, at his best, incisive criticism, at his worst, mere trolling.
Mhm. Yeah,
It's
I
also
like,
kind of reassuring to realize that it's always going on. This is not new.
even though they didn't have Twitter. I want to go back for a second for that you have a full-time job, because I can imagine people are going, how does she work full-time, have a young child, and do all of this? Well, write the book and now talk about the book, write a lot of articles about the book. So do you sleep?
I do less than I should. A lot of this happens early mornings and late nights. Like, for instance, today I was up around 5 and my baby didn't get up until about 8:30. So I had to go wake him up. That's not typical, but I try to seize on it when it does happen. To be honest, I often get the question about like work-life balance and so on. I'm a workaholic. This makes me tick. And I try not to take away time from my family. Our dinner time and early hours of the early evening, that's ours. And I'm not going to go off and work during that period. Though I will say, in the weeks after the book's launch, like I often didn't have a whole lot of choice about that when I had some really tough deadlines. Yeah, it's a full on day and I often feel exhausted, but it's how it has to happen because I can't make a living from the writing. I'm not going to give up the writing. And I also don't want to give up having a family life either. But I will say my social life has definitely suffered. I haven't seen friends in a couple of months now, which I'm not super happy about, but it's something that had to fall by the wayside as you're doing these other things. Thankfully, life is not always this full on with promoting the book. Here, I will say, one of the ways that this whole book happened, like how it got written on top of a full-time job, is my deadline got moved by 2 months. It got moved up. Like it was due in December, then it got moved to October, and I was having the baby in late July.
Oh,
Right. So thankfully, my company has a very generous, by American standards, maternity leave policy. So I had 4 months of paid leave. And that's when I wrote the book. The baby would wake up in the middle of the night, and I would just, until my husband took the baby in the morning, and I would just write through it. And the baby would wake up every hour like they do. And so I would feed him and put him back down and keep writing. And I was able to meet the deadline that way. But it was really just a kind of weird confluence of circumstances.
I thought I had it tough when I had to finish a book after I gave birth. Like I had to write the last 2 or 3 chapters. I thought that was hard.
Yep.
That's harder.
My
Wow.
brother read the last 2 sections of the book and he's like, I think you're starting to get really wild with the ideas here. And I was like, it's because I'm up in the middle of the night. I haven't slept. The baby's crying. I've got a deadline. So
There's a certain, there's must do. We make, do you going to write another book?
I really hope to. I'm starting to work on it now. We'll see. Just because the first one was saleable, who knows if you're going to sell the second one? That's another misimpression. It's not necessarily the case that it's easy to sell the second one, even if the first one, like the Poe book, is selling pretty well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be able to sell a second one, because it has to be an idea that a publisher finds saleable. It can't just be something that pleases me at this point. So
And that's true, especially since that I never thought about that, but pivoting off Poe's platform, say that 3 times really quickly, you then, unless you write something that pivots off someone else's platform or that can somehow build on your expanded platform, you're back to the beginning.
yeah. And I've been shocked to hear, I have friends who are much more successful writers who also, I'm like, you still have to write a book proposal? You still have to shop this to multiple publishers? And they say, yes, that's still how it happens, even at their level. When some of these people have hit bestseller lists, some have written acclaimed books, which in a way is reassuring because you think it's just you who's up against it, but really it's almost everyone.
Yeah, it's true. So I'd like to ask this last question of all my guests. What do you want to learn next?
I want to learn how to make a home. Like I was telling you, we bought this new house, and our last place was like very much just a do for the time. And now I just want to figure out not just how to decorate the rooms at all, but how to rearrange life so that there's like the warmth inside the house that you can sense. There's the happy family life. There's the like love and daily acts. Does that sound too cheesy?
That sounds
And it doesn't have to be,
beautiful.
I want cookies coming out of the oven. I want a happy child and for my husband and I to be happy and healthy and so on. So I'd like to figure out how to get better at those things, which I've never really given concentrated attention to before, and that feels very challenging. Like, how does that happen? I don't know.
Yeah, I think we all have strengths, right? Like my strength, I think maybe like your strength is working. And I noticed my child, who is 27, is also very good at working and not
Mhm.
so good at playing and not so good at, she's really good at her relationships. But I said, I just think that's what I modeled for you, the working mom. I didn't model
Mhm.
the cookie mom. So I think it's challenging because it's not our strengths, but it's also calling to you and you have to listen to that.
I will say that working moms weren't modeled for me, and finding it was like my first big journey of my adult life. And that was very important to me, like, because I don't know, maybe you found this too, but in some sense, like if you don't have your own work, then how do you find your place in the world? How do you make a place for yourself in the world? So those things are not divorced from each other at all in my
No,
experience.
no, yes, no, I can't agree with you. I have seen this so many times with women that I've worked with where they didn't do that for whatever reason. Maybe they had kids young or they had different things happen and they didn't make that work self. And it
Hmm.
haunts them for their whole lives, that sense of agency. And I think I did it so strongly because my mom didn't get to. She wanted to and she didn't get to, and then she was pretty much blocked from doing it for and time and dad and her
Hmm.
dad and all that. So yeah, I've identified very strongly with that.
Yeah, I wonder if you can have both. I want to see in my own life if it's possible to do both. I don't know that if I would have. I didn't feel this drive as strongly as I did before. I think it's emerged because I've started to be happy with my work life.
Yeah, I've got, but what is both? Having both? It's some kind of like you said, work-life balance. Bleh, let's just throw all that out. Like you'll make it your way. And
Yeah,
maybe it'll be challenging at first, but I think we have to throw out all of those ideas that have been foisted on us of what it means. I remember, oh my gosh, years and years ago, my daughter was a baby, like a toddler, and I was invited. We lived in this kind of ritzy neighborhood, and I was invited to Christmas cookie party. And my idea was to show up with the frozen loaf of
yes.
cookie dough. And I'm like, hi, I'm here. And I'll never forget the mom who was giving the party, just giving me this like incredibly like just shrivel up and die. You were supposed to bring baked cookies that are ready to decorate. And that I think is what we have to keep throwing out. Like I can still feel the
Hmm.
shame in my body,
Oh.
20 or 25 years later. And
Hmm.
that's the kind of whatever demarcations have been made with moms and women and everything else. We have to keep throwing that out and you'll find your way of a warm, welcoming, happy
I'm
home.
like nodding with the top half of my body as you're saying this thing.
And just
Oh, that sounds
keep
so
buying
real.
the cookies that you slice out of the damn freezer.
Is there another way?
Oh my God. Oh, Catherine, it's been fantastic to speak to you. I've learned so much from reading your Substack and reading the articles that you're putting out there. And it's really helping me think about my own platform and think about how to help writers. So I'm really grateful for you taking the time to talk to us and doing all that work in the world.
Thank you so much. I've been listening to the podcast and I geeked out at the Oliver Berkman one, and I'm really loving it. So thank you for having me on. It's such a pleasure.